Tonight we begin our study through the book of Revelation by way of an introduction. We're going to be looking first of all at how to properly interpret this book. Now, there are three books in the Bible that cover the timelines for these three strands of the human family. First of all, we have Daniel, which is a timeline for the Gentiles. Next, we have Ezekiel, which is the second timeline for the second strand of the human family, that is the Jewish people. And lastly, we now have the book of Revelation, which starts with the resurrection of Jesus Christ and takes Christians into eternity future. So that makes Revelation the timeline for Christians. Looking at the title of the book, Revelation, the very first word, the first word of verse 1. The name comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, which means the unveiling or the uncovering of something previously hidden. For example, Paul, when he wrote to the Romans, said, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed, apocalypto, in us." Then Peter wrote that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation, apocalypsis, of Jesus Christ. How about the theme of the book? Well, the opening verses of the book of Revelation, especially those first three verses, identify this basic twofold theme of the book. The first theme is the revelation of Jesus Christ, as we find there in the first verse. And Jesus will be revealed, first of all, as a judge, next as a redeemer, and thirdly, as the triumphant king. Secondly, Revelation is a set of instructions for believers. Instructions in the area of prophecy, instructions in the area of world history, instructions in the area of doctrinal instruction, and areas of spiritual application. For instance, as we look at these first three verses of the book of Revelation, we read, "The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants, things which must shortly take place. And he sent and signified it by his angel to his servant John, who bore witness to the word of God and to the testimony of Jesus Christ, to all things that he saw. Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near." So, therefore, we do have spiritual application based upon what these opening words tell us. How about the author? The authorship. Well, we know it to be John the Apostle, because four times the writer addresses himself as John. First, in Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, where we read, "And he sent and signified this revelation by his angel to his servant John." In verse 4, John writes from John to the seven churches. And in verse 9, he continues, "I, John, both your brother and companion in the tribulation and kingdom and patience of Jesus Christ." And then at the end of the book, in chapter 22, verse 8, John further writes, "Now I, John, saw and heard these things." Now, through the years, there's been objections to John as being the author of this book. And since the days of the Alexandrian school, which came to light in the 3rd century, the Johannine authorship has been in question for two main reasons. First of all, John did not identify himself as the Apostle John. Well, I'm sure that John, because of the nature of man, didn't want to give himself self-credit. And so therefore he did not identify himself, "I am the Apostle John." No, he just simply said, "I'm John, your fellow servant." Also, the other objection is that the writing style of the book of Revelation is too dissimilar to John's other writings. Certainly when you compare the book of Revelation, say, with his epistles there in the New Testament, The writing style is very different. But when we see the things that John witnessed, the things that he saw, the things that he heard, I'm sure that they were rather shocking to him and adversely affected his writing style. How about the date of writing? Another reason for contention. Now, there are two views regarding the date concerning the writing of this book. There's the early or the Neronic date, which they say occurred around AD 65 during the reign of Nero. And then there's the later date by what is known as the Domitian date around AD 95 during the reign of the Emperor Domitian. Now, noted authorities of the early church are in agreement. They agree that this book was written at the later date. And the descriptions of the seven churches in Revelation 2 and 3 show that symptoms of that second generation church all point to a later date. For instance, when Paul wrote to the book to the Ephesians there in his letter to the Ephesians, which we call the book of Ephesians, he did not identify any particular problems with that church. But later on, we know that when Jesus writes to that church, there are some problems which he addressed. And so again, when Paul wrote to the Ephesian church, that church had not left its first love. But later on, we know that that was the case. And of course, the church in Smyrna was undergoing persecution. Now, this church did not exist during the time when Paul planted churches. Polycarp, a contemporary of John the Apostle, was the pastor of that church, and the testimony of his martyrdom speaks of the kind of persecution that was taking place later in that first century. The present advocates of the early date of those who hold to the preterist view of interpretation say that this was written at a much earlier date. Now, these adherents believe that the judgment of Revelation are the result of the Roman invasion that took place in the AD 70 when the Romans invaded Jerusalem and destroyed that city and the temple. However, history records that John was banished to the island of Patmos by Domitian in AD 95 after a failed attempt to put him to death by boiling him into hot oil. How about the acceptance of the book? Know that the book of Revelation was not commonly received by the church as being canonical. In other words, it wasn't included in the New Testament until the middle of the second century due to the difficulty with the unusual nature of the book. Secondly, the difficulty with the millennial teaching of chapter 20. However, the early church did not object to the fact that John was the author, John the Apostle as the author. How about the purpose of the book? First of all, it is addressed to believers in Jesus Christ. We read there in verse 1, to show his servants, that is, bondslaves, this revelation. Also, it is a warning to non-believers of the coming judgments. It is an encouragement to believers to persevere under the stress of persecution in hope that justice will eventually triumph in the coming of Jesus Christ. And looking at our current age, we have to almost conclude that things are not going to become more rosy as time progresses, but will become more and more difficult. And so all the more reason that we need to know the book of Revelation and to study it. Also, it is a warning to believers of the coming apostasy that will spread throughout the earth. And certainly we're seeing much of that happening today, are we not? Now coming to the subject of interpretation. There's basically four viewpoints, and you see them listed here. The idealist or symbolic interpretation, the preterist interpretation, the historicist interpretation, and the futurist interpretation. First of all, the idealist or symbolic interpretation of the book. This view sees all of Revelation as only a series of pictures teaching spiritual truth. In other words, there's not actually a literal scene that we're going to be seeing in this book based upon this viewpoint. Therefore, they claim there is no prophecy or specific historical events as recorded in the book of Revelation. The preterist view. This view sees all of Revelation historically fulfilled in the first century, with eternal destinies taught in the last two chapters. This view also holds that Jesus returned in AD 70 to judge unbelieving Israel. And these who hold this view teach that believers are now living in the new heaven and the new earth. And certainly that would be a stretch of tremendous imagination. Extreme preterists believe that there's no second coming at all, no final resurrection, and no final judgment. Now, as with any viewpoint, there's both extremes. And so we come now to the partial preterists, and people such as the late R.C. Sproul would hold to this position. These believe that Jesus returned in AD 70, but they still believe that there will be a second coming, a resurrection, and a coming judgment. They also believe that the various judgments, that is, the seal judgments, the trumpet judgments, and the bowl judgments, were the result of the Roman invasion in AD 70. And as such, all preterists reject the literal interpretation of the book of Revelation. They view Revelation to be written around the dates of 65 to 66 AD in order to justify the AD 70 date, which, as they say, is when Rome invaded Jerusalem and fulfilled the prophecies of the book of Revelation. Now we come to the historical view. Those who hold this view simply see the entire book as a symbolic representation of church history, ending with the second advent of the second coming of Christ. And adherents of this view see that the beast of Revelation 13 as simply being the Pope and the papacy, which accounts for the popularity of this interpretation during the Reformation period. Now the future or correct view. The correct view views Revelation chapter 4 onward as prophecy that is yet to be fulfilled. This interpretation is based upon a literal approach to interpreting Bible prophecy. Again, I want to emphasize a literal approach to the interpretation of Bible prophecy. Those who hold this view, Calvary Chapel included, are premillennial and pre-tribulation. That meaning that we believe that the church will be raptured to heaven prior to the millennium and prior to the tribulation period. Now concerning the millennium, looking at the schools of interpretation, we hold to the premillennial view, which means the church age will come to its end prior to the millennial, and certainly prior to the tribulation period. But during the millennium, Christ will come to earth before the millennium begins to rule with his saints for a little 1,000 years. During that time, of course, Satan will be bound for that period of time, just as we're told in Revelation chapter 20. And we looked at this a couple of weeks ago. It will be a time of peace and prosperity, for that nation of Israel will be restored after national repentance and after the time of Jacob's trouble. Now the premillennial view. This view says that Christ will come to earth before the millennium to rule with his saints for a literal 1,000 years. Satan is bound for that period of time, as we read in Revelation chapter 20. It will be a time of peace and prosperity, and the nation of Israel will be restored after national repentance and after the time of Jacob's trouble. And of course, you and I, the church, the bride of Christ, will come with him from heaven to earth, and we will rule and reign with him during that period of time. Then there's the postmillennial view. This view holds that the second coming of Christ is at the end of the millennium. The millennium is a period of time, not necessarily a 1,000-year period of blessedness, prosperity for God's kingdom in the world. And accordingly, the millennium is at the present time, and that Satan is no longer active. Well, that is certainly a stretch because we know that he is. Because the world is becoming increasingly corrupt, those who hold this view are obviously decreasing in number. Then there's the amillennial viewpoint. Those who hold this view say there's no such thing as a millennial reign of Christ. So they're saying that no literal reign of Christ on earth for the 1,000-year period. The millennium is simply a spiritual reign of Christ with his saints in heaven at the current time. Here's the subject of symbolism. And certainly the book of Revelation is filled with a lot of symbolism, which we'll be looking at. Now, there are four apocalyptic books in the Bible, chiefly Daniel, Ezekiel, Zechariah, and the book of Revelation. The term apocalyptic refers to the use of symbolism to communicate an absolute truth. Now, these symbols are not an allegory or a fairy tale. No, they are symbols that will be defined or interpreted by another portion of apocalyptic literature in some other place of the Bible. Therefore, it is inductive Bible study, and it is the approach that you must take when you're trying to determine the apocalyptic literature of what the apocalyptic literature is talking about. So inductive Bible study is, of course, using the Bible and realizing that the Bible is self-interpretive. In other words, it will give its own interpretation. Now, the use of symbols in the book of Revelation has led to two extremes. First of all, the use of symbols show that the book cannot be understood and must be interpreted in terms in general, that being the conflict between good and evil. Beyond this, the book is not to be understood to any great detail. In other words, the general theme being that it's a conflict or war between that which is good and that which is evil, and all symbols point to that. Symbols that are used for unchecked speculation, sensationalism, and all kinds of guesswork in trying to interpret the symbols in light of the current events. This has led to misinterpretations as current events change and even date setting comes about. So you can't just use symbols without carefully tracing the full meaning of them. Otherwise, you'll end up with the wrong conclusions. Now, this book has perhaps more symbolism than any other book of the Bible. Now, many books that are apocalyptic in character use many symbols. We see this in the book of Ezekiel, the book of Daniel, and Zechariah, and we'll see some examples of that. Because symbols are not always clearly explained, it's necessary to have a proper approach to their interpretation. So therefore, there are three fundamental principles in interpreting symbolism. The names of the symbols are to be understood literally. When God calls a book is to be interpreted as a book. The symbols always denote something essentially different from themselves. Some resemblance, more or less minute, is traceable between the symbol and the thing being symbolized, and we'll give you some examples of that. Always remember that the Bible is self-interpretive. We will see an example of this in chapter 12, where John is told of a great wonder in heaven that he sees. A woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars upon her head. So we ask ourselves, well, where have we seen this imagery before? Well, when we get to chapter 12, we'll see the answer. Another example is in Daniel chapter 2, where we have the prophecy of that dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. Daniel, of course, was the one that the Lord used to give the proper interpretation of that dream. And that dream was all about this statue, composed of a head of gold and so forth. And each part of that statue represented a Gentile world empire that in Daniel's day was still immediate or in the future. And of course, as you go down the statue, you see various parts of that statue, and each part represented some future Gentile world rulership that would take place. In the book of Revelation, as we pointed out, there's perhaps more symbolism than any other book. First of all, we think about the dragon, a symbol of Satan. Now, is Satan truly a dragon? No, he is a spirit. He's not a physical being of any kind. Also, in chapter 13, we have mentioned the first beast, which is symbolic of the Antichrist. And then we have another beast mentioned there, which is symbolic of the false prophet called another beast. And then in chapter 17 and also chapter 13, we have mentioned the 7 heads. And proper interpretation will tell us that these are 7 empires from history that persecuted Israel: Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, and that future worldwide kingdom, the Antichrist kingdom. Then we have the lion and the lamb, which are 2 aspects of the ministry of Jesus. First of all, Jesus is a lion from the tribe of Judah. In other words, he has conquered. How did he conquer? He conquered as a lamb by assuming a position of vulnerability, by serving as the lamb and being slain. And so therefore at the cross, even though Jesus was that lamb that was slain, he ended up being a conqueror as well. The book of Revelation is also filled with many numbers and references to numbers. For instance, the number 1 is the source of all numbers. It stands for God. There in Deuteronomy chapter 6, we're told that God is one. The number 2, 2 witnesses, meaning separation, or a double portion, or 2 witnesses, as we'll see there in Revelation chapter 11. We're told also that with a minimum of 2 witnesses, every word was to be established. 3, the number of individual completion, about the Trinity, or the threefold cord there in Ecclesiastes, or about us as human beings, composed of body, soul, and spirit, 3 parts. 4, worldly number. There's 4 seasons, 4 directions, 4 elements. 5, speaks of grace, provision, fullness. 5 months is mentioned in the book of Revelation. Remember David's 5 stones that he picked up. 6, which is a number for man. It always speaks of that which is incomplete. It also represents beast and Satan. The 6th day, of course. We know there's 7 days per week, but 6 days is incomplete. So 6 days a week we work, the 7th we rest, which is the Sabbath. 7 speaks of completeness. The 7th day of the week completes the week. And it also was the number for the Lord himself, because he is complete in every aspect of his being. We also see here in the book of Revelation 7 churches, 7 years, and 7 beatitudes. Number 8 represents the new beginning, appropriately for our church, Calvary Chapel, New Beginnings. Also, it was a new beginning for Noah, for David, who is the 8th son, and it speaks of the 8th day, or a new week, being Sunday. Christ rose from the dead on the 8th day. The church started meeting on Sunday, which they called the 8th day. The number 10 speaks of worldly completion, or law or government. In the book of Revelation and also in the book of Daniel, we read of 10 horns. We have 10 fingers, 10 toes. In the Old Testament historical books, we have the 10 tribes of Israel. And finally, the number 12, the final number of completeness. It represents divine government. We have 12 months in the year. There are 12 tribes of Israel. There are 12 apostles. There are 12 stars in the crown of the woman in Revelation chapter 12. There are 12 gates in the New Jerusalem and 12 fruits in the tree of life. So here we have the various numbers that are recorded throughout the book, like the 144,000 Jewish evangelists. We see the number 7 repeated many times. 7 spirits, 7 lampstands, 7 churches, but also 2 deaths, 7 stars, 2 witnesses. 7 seals, 42 months, which is 3.5 years. 7 trumpets, 12 gates in the New Jerusalem. 7 vials or bowls in those judgments. There's 12 apostles. There's 7 last plagues. There's 24 elders, as we'll see in chapter 4 and chapter 5. There's 7 beatitudes throughout the book of Revelation. We know that there's 12,000 born-again witnesses from the 12 tribes of Israel. There will be 7 heads represented by the 7 kingdoms that persecute Israel. There will be 7,000 killed in Jerusalem. There are 7 crowns. There are 4 mysteries. There are 7 lamps of fire, which represent the churches of Revelations 2 and 3. There's 1,260 days, which come up again to be 3.5 years. There are 7 horns and 12 foundation stones. There are 7 eyes and 12,000 furlongs. There are 7 thunders. So, as you can see, there's many mentions of numbers throughout the book of Revelation, which is important to notice. As we think about that, we must keep in mind what the intention was of the author who wrote this book, and what was the understanding of the author considering his time frame, and what was the understanding of the readers during the prophet's day, and what is the application for us to observe, and the use of this text, how it is used elsewhere in the New Testament. And notice that the reference of the Old Testament applications and examples. I think the guiding principle as we seek to interpret this book is what is known as the Golden Rule of Interpretation by D.L. Cooper, whereby he wrote, "When the plain sense of Scripture makes common sense, seek no other sense. Therefore take every word as its primary, ordinary, usual literal meaning, unless the facts of the immediate context, studied in the light of the related passages, and the axiomatic and fundamental truths indicate clearly otherwise." The important point being, seek that literal sense when possible. For example, we're going to look at how comparative language is used here in the book. The Greek word hos or hos is used 68 times in Revelation and 416 times in the New Testament. When it's translated into words such as who, which, what, whom, and whose. There in Revelation chapter 17, verse 18, we have an example of the use of this word. "And the woman whom you saw is that great city which reigns over the kings of the earth." Now, when we get to that chapter, we'll note that woman. She's not a physical woman, but is, again, a symbol representing something. The Greek word homolios is used 22 times in Revelation and 26 times throughout the rest of the New Testament. It's translated like, as, or like as. For instance, there in Revelation chapter 1, we'll read, "His feet were like homolios, fine brass, as homolios, if refined in a furnace, and his voice as homolios, the sound of many waters." In these instances, symbols are employed within similes, giving greater detail and richness. When these words are used, John is comparing the unknown with the known. And, that's how we learn today. We learn the unknown by starting with the known and going from there. And so that's how we accumulate or learn knowledge. Now, going back to your high school English classes where you learned figures of speech. 2 of those figures of speech were similes and metaphors. So what is a simile? A simile compares 2 unlike things by the use of the word like or as, while a metaphor attributes the qualities of one thing to another using the terms like or as. An example of a metaphor is the church of Laodicea, where Jesus addressed that church by calling it lukewarm, poor, blind, and naked. Well, we know that this church was not staffed full of naked people. They weren't physically blind. In fact, they were not poor, not from a worldly perspective. They were very prosperous. But Jesus saw them from a different viewpoint because they were poor spiritually, and therefore they ended up being lukewarm. Revelation employs over 70 similes, beginning with the vision concerning Jesus himself, one like a son of man, who is described by using 9 similes throughout the book. These similes illuminate particular aspects of Jesus' person and his role, while conveying that the risen Jesus surpasses anything that his readers have experienced. So, figurative versus non figurative. If a word or act, taken in a literal sense, fails to harmonize with either the flow of thought in the text or the context, or with the analogy of Scripture, it is to be understood to be figurative, that is, not literal. Otherwise, it is non figurative or is literal. This is a quote from a scholar by the name of Tam. For example, there in Revelation chapter 20, we have these words: Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, having the key to the bottomless pit, and a great chain in his hand. He laid hold of the dragon, that serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. So, how are we to interpret this statement? What rules are we to rely upon to have a proper understanding? Well, know this: it is figurative. Why? Because Satan is a spirit, and spirits cannot be bound by physical means. Therefore, the chain must be figurative. Now, there was a time when certain terms or descriptions were determined to be figurative, that is, not literal. For instance, we are told that when Jesus returns, every eye will see him. Of course, with our understanding of technology and communication, we now know this is possible. Additionally, with the present weapons of war, such as nuclear bombs and guided missiles, we know that global destruction is also possible, which makes the book of Revelation all the more understandable. But putting ourselves in John's shoes in his day, he could not fathom how every eye living on this planet could possibly see Jesus all at once. But of course, we know that that is possible. There in Revelation chapter 9, John describes a scene which he sees. He says that they, that is, these demons, had breastplates like, there's that word hos again, breastplates of iron. And the sound of their wings was like, there's the word hos, the sound of chariots with many horses running into the battle. Now, of course, John was thinking in terms of what he was familiar with in his day. Roman soldiers, or soldiers in general, all had breastplates. And so when he saw these demons ascending out of the bottomless pit, as he looked at them and looked at their description, he concluded that they had breastplates of iron. Also, he said that the sound was like chariots with many horses. And of course, he didn't know anything about cars and buses and things like that in his day. All he knew was what chariots were and horses. So, we must be careful to not read current conditions and events as a direct fulfillment of prophecy. I think of the book years ago that, who was it? I can never remember his name, who wrote the late great planet, late Hal Lindsey, who wrote the late great planet Earth, which kind of started this whole movement towards studying Bible prophecy. It was an amazing book. It stirred up a lot of hearts. But he equated a lot of the things in the book of Revelation and Bible prophecy with current events of his day. When I think about the fact that this book being filled with so much symbolism, so much figurative kinds of terms, it takes me back to the book of Daniel. And there in chapter 12, I kind of come to a conclusion perhaps. When Daniel was given this great revelation, which he wrote about there in his book, we're told that an angel told him that that book was that revelation was to be sealed up. He said, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end." And could it be that the reason Daniel was told this is because the things that were told about or talked about could not be properly understood until these end times, when technology and so forth and science would have a proper explanation. So, throughout the book, we have perfect symbolism in the visions and pictures that were given. There's 44 separate and distinct visions that are given to John. 4 times John said he was in the Spirit. In other words, he was put in a situation, I guess, where he was able to see things that could only be seen in the Spirit. 60 times John said, "I saw." In other words, he was a direct eyewitness of things that he observed. 12 times John was commanded to write something. 8 times we are given some chronology, the term "after these things," and we'll see more of that next week. The term "after these things" speaks about things that are occurring after certain things that have occurred. 28 times the term "the Lamb" is used to describe Jesus Christ. How about the uniqueness of this book? Well, know this, that Revelation is frequently a recap or a repeat of God's judgments and interventions found in the Old Testament. Therefore, without solid knowledge of the Old Testament, an accurate interpretation would be impossible. There's no book of the New Testament that is so thoroughly steeped in thought and imagery that of the Hebrew Scriptures, which would be the Old Testament, we're told by this commentator. There's so many today that will not teach the Old Testament. And by not teaching the Old Testament, they will have a skewed interpretation when it comes to teaching the book of Revelation. In fact, there's very little new that we will discover going through the book of Revelation, because what you find are things that God has already done or said, just being repeated in his book. Those commentators who describe the book of Revelation, they say that there's more than 280 to perhaps over 400 references to the Old Testament scriptures found in the book of Revelation. And so there's really not anything new. It's just a recap or a rehearsal of things that God has already said or done. Now, with the abundance of Old Testament references found in the book of Revelation, this has led to many to reject the canonicity of Revelation due to that is the commentators, of an anti-Semitic bias. For instance, Luther in his earlier writings was very anti-Semitic. He had no use for the Jews whatsoever, because he said, it was the Jews who killed the Messiah, who killed their Savior. And so therefore God was done. They had crossed the line, and God had no future plan for the nation of Israel. And so he basically wrote off the Jewish nation. John Calvin, another reformer, who wrote so many commentaries throughout the Bible, yet he omitted the book of Revelation completely. Some more observations. Look at the various terms and how often they are repeated. Now look at those numbers. So many of them. So again, we see repetition just running rampant throughout the book. And there's a reason for that. And it should draw our attention to study them. For instance, I mentioned already the term "after these things," which introduce some chronology into the book. So perhaps we should trace those back. I'd already mentioned that there are 7 beatitudes, blessings that God pronounces upon those who not only read but also hear and do those things. And so this is just kind of an impression I want to get across, that there are many terms that are repeated time and time and time again throughout the book, and that should draw our attention. The most important thing The most important thing that we need to note is that this book is the revelation of Jesus Christ. We will see him in ways that he's never been revealed before. We'll see his true character. We'll see him in his glorified state. And we'll understand the tremendous impression that we will have when that day comes when we will see him as he is. When John saw him, notice his response. When I saw him, I fell at his feet as dead. Now, this is the same John, the same Apostle John, who years earlier, sitting next to Jesus at that Last Supper, leaned his head and rested upon the breast of Jesus. He was not terrified. He felt very much at home. But now in the book of Revelation, he sees his Lord and Savior in a very different way. He sees the glorified Lord. And when he sees that, he falls down as like a dead man. Now, we go through the scriptures, and what we read about John and his response here is nothing new. For instance, going back in time, there's many when they saw the Lord. When Moses was upon the Mount Sinai, and the glory of God passed by him. Oh my goodness, it had such a pronounced effect upon his being. Other individuals, I think of Ezekiel, when he sees the glory of the Lord, and he sees those amazing scenes, and boy, it has a tremendous impact upon him. He also falls down almost like a dead man. How about Daniel? When he sees some semblance of the Lord there in Daniel chapter 10, he falls down without having any strength whatsoever. Job, having been addressed directly by the Lord there in his book, there beginning in chapter 38 through chapter 42, Job says, he said, in the past I've heard you with my ear, but now I see you with my eye, and seeing you I see myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. So there are just so many throughout the scriptures that when they see some semblance of God, like Isaiah there in Isaiah chapter 6, when he sees the glory of the Lord. And seeing the glory of the Lord, Isaiah saw a true picture of himself. And what he saw was not pleasing at all. So as you go through the scriptures, you see what John experienced as others experience in much the same way. And one day we will also see the glory of the Lord. And I wonder, what will our response be? Look at the many references of Jesus, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, the ruler of the kings of the earth, the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the living one, the one who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, the one who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. We just have countless references to Jesus, but again, those similes that are used to describe him in various terms. In our understanding of the book, what are we to understand? Well, first of all, we are to know that this book is understandable. Now, for centuries, there were those who taught that the book was not understandable, and so the book was completely neglected. But we're told in Revelation chapter 1, verse 3, blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near. So I'm thinking that this book is understandable because we're told that if we read the book, we will be blessed. And not only if we read, but also hear the words of this prophecy, we will be blessed. And therefore, that should lead to the fact that we should keep the things that are written in it. So I'm looking at that, believing with all my heart that God intends for this book to be understandable, and indeed it is. Jesus frequently told of the importance of having ears to hear, meaning that we must have an open and prepared heart. I really think that perhaps the most repeated thing that he said was, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. We find that here in the Gospels and also 7 times here in the book of Revelation. Therefore, he wants us to read and understand the prophecies of this book. And not only are we to read this book, but we are also instructed to read it for others to hear. Therefore, pastors are to give out the message of this book. We are told that the message is also urgent. Going back to verse 3 of chapter 1, blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of this prophecy and keep those things which are written in it, for the time is near. And boy, are we ever near to seeing the fulfillment of the many prophecies of this book. And certainly it just adds to the urgency for us to be able to know this book. It just saddens my heart today that there's so many pulpits that are so silent when it comes to Bible prophecy, and especially the book of Revelation. Seeing the time in which we live, where events are being fulfilled that line up with Bible prophecy, those events that Jesus told us about, as we see these things come about, as we see prophecies being fulfilled, it's like handwriting on the wall. And pastors everywhere should be warning and preparing the people for these coming days. But unfortunately, there's so many pulpits, as I say, that are silent regarding these prophecies. And why? Well, there's many reasons. So many call Bible prophecy doom and gloom. And they're thinking that they're people, they don't want to be told messages on doom and gloom. After all, that will affect the offerings, and we can't have that. So therefore, we need to encourage the people and give them cheerful messages and build them up so they'll be happy. Well, unfortunately, people are not being completely prepared for the days that are coming. I think we've already seen our best days, and there's no rosy days up ahead. But regardless of the time frame, the theme of this book is one of urgency because it gives us as believers hope of the soon and coming King, Jesus Christ. But whether he comes in our lifetime or at a later time, people need to know the the message of the book of Revelation. Let's look briefly at the chronology of the book. As we start in chapter 1, we have the completion of the church age, and that'll span the first 3 chapters. Then the church, of course, is raptured to heaven, and we'll see a sense of that beginning with chapter 4. Beginning with chapter 4, we'll have the preparation for the coming tribulation period, which will begin in chapter 6. But before that period of time, there's some events that will take place in heaven. We've already looked at the fact that there's that judgment seat of Christ, which is the judgment for all believers, followed by the marriage supper of the Lamb. So then the tribulation will begin in chapter 6 and extend all the way to chapter 18. When we get to chapter 19, this is the time when Jesus and the saints, that is the church, the bride of Christ, return to this earth and put down all Gentile rule. And Jesus will then set up his millennial kingdom there in chapter 20. At the end of chapter 20, we have the great white throne judgment, where all unbelievers will be judged before that great white throne. And then chapters 21 and 22, we have the eternal state, and we're given a description of what that time will be like. Now, as you cruise the internet, you'll find all kinds of timelines and descriptions concerning that. For instance, here are the 7 churches. Other descriptions were seen, like the first and second half of the tribulation period. I want to draw your attention to the 3 series of judgments. Beginning in chapter 6, we have the 6 or 7 seal judgments, followed by the 7 trumpet judgments, and then followed by the 7 vial or bowl judgments. But keep in mind, as we start with those seal judgments, the first 6 judgments are specific judgments, these seal judgments. But the 7th judgment is not a judgment per se. But what it does, it introduces the series of trumpet judgments. And when you come to the 7th trumpet judgment, rather than a judgment per se, it introduces the final 7 judgments, which are the bowl or vial judgments. So keep in mind that kind of a picture as we progress seeing those judgments. That sequence of events beginning in chapter 6, extending all the way to chapter 20. The main action, of course, beginning in chapter 6 are the 6 seals. And there's an intermission between the 6th and the 7th seal. And remember, the 7th seal introduces the 7 trumpets. But there's an intermission found in chapter 7. It's a parenthetical pause so we can get a close look at what's happening. The main action returns again in chapters 8 with that 7th seal, which opens up the 7 trumpet judgments. And then again, there's another intermission between the 6th and 7th trumpet, 6th and trumpet judgments between Revelation 10 and 15. And the main action resumes again in chapter 16 with the 7 full bowl judgments that will take place. And there's another intermission describing the destruction of Babylon the Great, that worldwide religious system and that worldwide empire in chapters 17 and 18. And then the action will once again start up again in chapter 19 with the second coming and the beginning of the millennial kingdom. So those 3 brown lines are parenthetical pauses. Now, the timeline continues on, but these parenthetical pauses allow us to see things that are taking place on earth during that timeline. So keep that in mind. Again, looking at the overview, there's things that take place in heaven, there's things that take place upon the earth. And you see how the various descriptions of those various events, both in heaven and earth, as they take place. And we don't have the time to go through and just identify each and every one of them. So I'm just trying to leave an impression with you that there's things that will take place in heaven that will initiate the events that take place upon the earth. So how do we approach this study? First of all, we start with prayer. We pray with a humble heart, depending upon the Lord for understanding. We must rely upon Jesus' promise that he has given us the Holy Spirit who will lead us into all truth. Notice what Jesus said. However, when he, the Spirit of truth, has come, he will guide you into all truth. For he will not speak on his own authority, but whatever he hears, he will speak, and he will tell you things to come. So keep in mind, if we really are diligent in our study of the scriptures, and we are patient, and we wait upon the Lord, believing in his promise that he has given us his Holy Spirit, who will guide us into all truth and teach us all things that we need to know, that in time he will do just that. Using all kinds of wonderful resources that the Lord has provided, we will come to the proper interpretation of these important prophecies. So as we approach now the study of a book like the book of Revelation, certainly it would be advantageous if we had knowledge of the original languages such as Greek and Hebrew. But I'm sure for the most part, you and I do not have that advantage. So where do we start? Well, we start with a good Bible translation. Now, there's 2 philosophies of translation. Initially, there was what we call the word-for-word translation, translating from the ancient Greek to the English language as closely as possible, word for word. The original King James, for instance, was a good word-for-word translation. And there's been many other word-for-word translations that have come about in recent years. Translations like the New American Standard Version, or the New King James Version, which is what we use at Calvary Chapel New Beginnings, and that most Calvary Chapel pastors use. But there's also another kind of philosophy of translation, I should say, and that is the thought-for-thought translation, which some have called the dynamic equivalency type of translation. Now, rather than translating word for word, they take ideas or thoughts and translate the thoughts. And so these, they say, make it more readable. For instance, translations like the New International Version, the New Living Translations. Certainly, they're much easier to read and to understand, but understand that they're just being translating the thoughts, just the thoughts are being translated and not the words. So you have to, if you're going to use one of these more modern translations like these dynamic equivalencies or these thought for thought translations, my encouragement to you is always have alongside a good word for word translation like the New King James Version of the Bible. So that's another resource. Also, use concordances and lexicons or cross references. I use cross references a lot. Someone has uh, put together a cross reference system that's become the standard, and there's supposedly 580,000 cross references been put together. And of course, a lot of our Bibles today have those center column cross references and so forth like that. So I use cross references a lot. Again, looking at other portions of Scripture to add meaning or proper interpretation. Then, of course, we can turn to commentaries or Bible encyclopedias that give us additional reference material. Lastly, using uh, like historical references, cultural materials like what was it like to live during the day of Jesus and things like that? What were the manners and the customs of the day and so forth? They just give you background information so you can properly put yourself in the shoes of, say, John, who wrote this book. What was it like living in his day? What was his perspective? And so these kinds of resources give you that kind of information. So there we have our introduction to the book of Revelation. So therefore we conclude with, do you have any questions? Any questions?